Hello, everyone, and I am happier than I can plausibly say to welcome you back to the in-person resumption of the Research Group on Constitutional Studies lecture series, and particularly grateful that you're, in spite of it being that day in Montreal, willing to come spend it inside in intellectual activities instead. I'm Jacob Levy. I'm the coordinator of the Research Group on Constitutional Studies. RGCS is a unit of the Yan P. Lin Center for the Study of Freedom and Global Orders in the Ancient and Modern Worlds. RGCS, as a research community, brings together faculty, postdocs, PhD and MA students, and undergraduates in a variety of programs in political theory and political philosophy, constitutional and public law, and constitutional level political science. The RGCS Lecture series, which is nearly, though not quite as old as RGCS itself, aims to break down some of the barriers that traditionally separate intellectual inquiry among the various levels of those who are engaged in academia, fighting against the urge to have serious researchers travel to other universities presenting their research to faculty and graduate students, and edutainers of various kinds to travel the circuit to give talks to undergraduates. We believe, and I think have been justified, have been borne out in believing over the course of now the last 10 years, that very skilled researchers are often also very skilled teachers. And we aim to bring to McGill very skilled researchers who are doing important ongoing work on the values, institutions, and principles of free societies, work that crosses disciplinary boundaries among the disciplines that I've mentioned, as well as reaching into the rest of the social sciences, history, and more of philosophy and law. Bringing those researchers to present their research and work and ideas in a way that is broadly accessible to our whole research community, faculty, graduate students, and undergraduates alike. The RGCS Lecture Series has been unsurprisingly remote for the last 2 years. Since before that time, the events have been recorded and are available on the Lin Center's YouTube channel. The events from the last 2 years, which have included a number of really wonderful speakers, were recorded from Zoom and are also available on the YouTube channel, and the same will be true for today's. At the end of the talk, I will have a few concluding things, including mention of upcoming events, following which you're invited to join us at a reception in the adjoining room. McGill University is on land which has long served as a meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous peoples. We acknowledge and thank the diverse Indigenous peoples whose presence marks this territory on which the peoples of the world now gather. And it is my great pleasure to welcome, as the first in-person speaker in 2 years, to welcome back to McGill, Professor Dale Turner. Dale Turner, who holds his PhD in philosophy from McGill University, is Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Toronto, having previously been Associate Professor of Government and of Native American Studies at Dartmouth College. He is one of the leaders in the younger generation of political theorists and political philosophers working on the intersection of Indigenous rights, Indigenous thought, and political theory and philosophy, and is the author of the tremendous and tremendously influential "This is Not a Peace Pipe" toward a critical Indigenous philosophy. His talk today, I'm going to get it right, will be Words and Deeds, Indigenous Spirituality, and the Limits of Language. Please join me in welcoming back to McGill, Professor Dale Turner.
Thank you. Thank you. Wow. I've been living in the UK, and I don't think anyone wears masks in the UK for the last month or so. So it feels good to take it off. Thank you so much for that a kind introduction, and it is great to be back here. And I guess when I think about, well, first, before I begin, I've been having some problems with my eyes. So is Aaron here? Aaron Mills? He wasn't? Okay, or Josh? Is Josh? Okay, I'll see them after. It's because I was going to mention their work in here. Coming back to Montreal and thinking about a kind of land acknowledgement, I was here during the so-called Oka crisis and in 1990 in the summer, and I just remember, learning a lot about the Indigenous presence in this area in very profound ways, and this area itself being a kind of meeting ground historically between the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee and the Algonquin up Barrier Lake, and the issues happening up there during the time that I was a student here. But also to think about that time in other ways. I did my undergrad at Concordia, which I loved, and to see some people that I know, especially Daniel Weinstock, Professor Weinstock, who was a dear friend at the time, and it's interesting to come back decades later when I actually had a job for a while, and of course being here as a student. Did they still do the Peel Pub 35-cent beer kind of thing?
45 cents.
45 cents now. Yeah. Anyway, it's really fabulous to be back here. I went to go to the bookstore. That's gone. I don't know where that disappeared to. But in acknowledging, especially in this, in returning and acknowledging that Indigenous presence, especially since I've received a real, I think, great foundation in thinking about politics and thinking about political philosophy. In particular, I was a Taylor Tully student, which used to be a big deal at one time, decades ago. And then to go out as an academic, work at Dartmouth, and then I've also spent some time doing some work with the Maori in South America, with Kanaka Maoli in Hawaii, and to make the connections between my education in philosophy and the history of ideas, and to weave that into a kind of activist's perspective, an activist's participation in on-the-ground Indigenous issues has presented a lot of challenges. And I've now returned, in some sense, to thinking about Indigenous intellectual culture. In particular, one of the ideas I had in my book was on a word warrior culture, and I argued that Indigenous intellectuals need to learn the sort of history of ideas and the methodologies of the human social sciences. They need to learn the ways of thinking of the dominant culture because they need that language to be able to speak to them. And now I've kind of returned to this problem because one of the provisions that was central to this was that they were to be guided by the ways of knowing and the Indigenous philosophies that are embedded in their communities. So you go off to school, but you return to your community. And what I didn't really think about was that process itself of learning, for example, the social contract theory, learning about John Locke's theory of property, and seeing how the idea of property became embedded in law and in the sort of everydayness of Western European cultures in a way that you could keep it separate from the beliefs that for many Indigenous peoples grew up with, in particular traditionalists. And I've kind of returned now to this idea of an intellectual culture. And this is why this term Indigenous spirituality has become central to my thinking, because it's what our medicine people, our traditionalists, people who speak the language, who know the ceremonies, who understand Indigenous ways of knowing, and teach teach people in their communities and outside their communities. They use this term Indigenous spirituality. They will argue. Their explanations for why Indigenous people still own their homelands is rooted in the claim, right, that they have these spiritual relationships to their lands and their homelands. That's the source of political legitimacy. But the term Indigenous spirituality is an English term. So there's a disjuncture between the ways and forms of being, the ways of knowing that I have seen over the decades, rooted in the land, rooted in the language and the relationship between the people who live on the land, the language, and the external world. And it's given rise to what I would say are ways of being in the world, which of course is also a concept in certainly people like Heidegger and so on, that are central to their relationships to land. The problem is that these relationships to land, at least from a traditionalist perspective, are the source of actual ownership. So when our medicine people say, we still own our lands, this is the headspace, right, that they think about their relationships to land. But by the time you get into a court of law, and you have to use the language of law, just out of curiosity, how many of you are law students? Not too many, okay. By the time you get into a court of law, the language has changed. In my own community, so as a way of introducing myself further, my father is a Temiagama Anishinaabe from Temagami, Ontario, in northern Ontario. And my mother is from England, in Devon. And as I've gotten older, I have spent more time in England. My partner now is from North Yorkshire, and during the pandemic, I've been able to work from North Yorkshire, which is kind of, it's too bad because I kind of like, let's see how long we can keep this going so I can stay in the UK. But I think the gig is up. I think I'm going to have to move back to Toronto in September. So I even gave up my apartment. I'm homeless. Oh my God, I'm homeless and landless. Okay, that was a joke. My community, the Temagami, we had a land claim case that ultimately went to the Supreme Court. Can I get a glass of water too, please? Thanks. We had a case that went to the Supreme Court in the early 90s. I got interested in that. That's what, in a sense, propelled me to study philosophy. I did my undergrad at Concordia. Thank you. I did my undergrad at Concordia and then went to McGill for my PhD. A couple of my classmates, Cressida Hayes and Natalie Oman, Rebecca Peet, remember Rebecca? And just brilliant people, and learned so much from them. I got interested in the land claim case, and one of the things that made me want to study philosophy was that I grew up understanding the relationships to land in a particular way, but I always thought the arguments were pretty simple that our medicine people were taking into a court of law. But by the time they got through the process of going to court, their claims and what counted as evidence became distorted, and the ways of thinking were marginalized. And so I got really interested in that phenomena, in particular, how sort of power was woven into that process, right, of going to court, of having to explain ourselves in a court of law. So that's been a big part of my work. And I think that well, frankly, the word I would use is naive, belief in a way was that by learning, going to school to figure out how the courts reasoned, that would be enough to empower ourselves in that relationship. And to a certain extent, it's true, and I'll come back to this at the end. To a certain extent, it's true because you'll always need a good lawyer. But colonialism doesn't, I've figured out, colonialism doesn't quite work that way. And it's able to shift the language and shift the ways of thinking about these issues in a way that continues to maintain that sort of relationship of domination over Indigenous peoples. And we're still seeing this today, in particular something like this UNDRIP legislation. So, actually, I should point out that I'm actually pretty optimistic. I will get to that optimism hopefully at some point. But the learning curve has been pretty high. I spent a year and a bit at the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, which was quite a learning experience. And I think what impressed me about this is RCAP is how the commissioners wrestled with this incredible amount of evidence, 20,000 pages of testimony from Indigenous peoples, ordinary Indigenous people who got to speak to the commissioners, and they just heard this over several years, over and over and over again, from medicine people, from traditionalists, from Indigenous peoples who were born and raised on the land. And I think they were deeply affected by that. And then the commission, for those of you who can remember, had to switch gears, and they had to take this giant listening exercise and weave it into a critique of contemporary policy. And they had a really hard time doing that because they did not know what to really do with what they heard from Indigenous peoples themselves. And so that was an important part for me. And I'm a big, I think there was a lot of good that came out of RCAP, and I've been trying to rethink how we can bring the basic principles of RCAP's vision, final vision, into contemporary politics. So I guess I should get going. So I wanted to flag this about land acknowledgements because I think there's a politics around land acknowledgements now that's growing, especially among Indigenous peoples. People like Hayden King at X University regrets having drafted this land acknowledgement. And the only thing I want to flag on this, which two examples here, McGill's and Toronto, which and I really appreciated yours as well. I think they're great, beautiful statements in some ways that many people need to be reminded. But what I want to flag with this, and I'll hopefully come back to this again, is that for a lot of Indigenous traditionalists, medicine people in particular, a land acknowledgement is part of their introduction. Indigenous peoples will introduce themselves, and the first thing they will normally speak their language if they can. I don't speak my language. I know certain concepts and words from talking to medicine people. I'm an Indigenous intellectual who feels uncomfortable learning the language to introduce myself and then switching to English. I sort of own up to the fact that I don't use the language as well, but I appreciate that that bringing the language right into a place such as this, because it's an important political move, if anything. But for a lot of medicine people, and the only way I can think about this is it's a kind of performative act that has what they would say spiritual significance. It's performative and phenomenological because it roots their voice and what they're saying to the land and place. And that's a kind of different back to this term spirituality then. So that introduction, that way of situating themselves, has this kind of profound spiritual dimension to it that I think gets lost. When I came here in 1992, all right, I might as well own up to it. I just turned 61, so I like, my partner is younger than me, but I like going out and telling people that I'm 61 because I always get, you don't look 61. You look 40, you know, kind of thing. So I'm in that period of time when I can get away with it, but I think in 5 years I cause gray hair, basically, is what it is. I don't get it myself. That performative, ontological, you know, these sorts of English terms, phenomenological. For those of you familiar with philosophy, you can see with the direction, right, that takes you in terms of the language that we use to capture something that's alive, basically. And that's really important and central to Indigenous medicine people in how they speak, in particular in formalized settings. Because the other important dimension with Indigenous ways, and in particular traditional ways, and with our medicine people, are protocols. Protocols and ceremonies are central for how these spiritual relationships can be nurtured. You know, and the political relationship, from my perspective, between Indigenous peoples and the Canadian government, the Canadian state, is as a nation-to-nation treaty relationship. So, and this is not an this is a very common way of thinking about the relationship. The federal government uses this language. But for Indigenous peoples, that term treaty relationship in particular is embedded, right, in this kind of spiritual relationship. That's why Indigenous peoples will say the treaties are sacred. And in moving from this word warrior culture to the way that I think about an Indigenous intellectual culture now, is that one of the questions that's important for us is, how do we listen to Indigenous peoples in and on their own terms? Right? That we need to be, and in particular Indigenous peoples, we need to think more about what it means to be guided by our medicine people. And so this is kind of what's the direction that my work has taken lately. I'm actually writing a novel. I have a fellowship at the Jackman Humanities Institute. As I like to say, I have the opportunity to write fiction on purpose, because everything seems to turn into fiction once it's published. And so I might as well own up to that. But there's a kind of philosophical exercise in telling a story that in some ways is a family resemblance. It's the other thing, deeply Wittgensteinian influence, so I'll try not to go too far in that direction. But there's a family resemblance to the way our court case evolved, the way the relationship has evolved between Indigenous peoples and the Canadian state, and where it could have gone had things been different. And I want to write about those forms of difference in the form of storytelling. So today what I want to do is I want to do three things. One is, I think whenever I have an opportunity or the need to talk about Indigenous rights or nationhood, I've discovered that we always need to have a kind of revisit the history of the relationship. And that's because, and this is the way I teach the course, teach a course on Indigenous rights in Canada, that at least from the white paper in 1969 up until now, Indigenous peoples have a very different perspective of that genealogy, mostly because of the sorts of traditional voices that get lost or set aside in that process. So I'm going to just walk through kind of quickly and do a brief genealogy of Indigenous rights. And then there are, I just want to flag, and there are many, but 6 exemplars of how Indigenous peoples have brought their spirituality, their own ways of thinking, Indigenous knowledge into the legal and political relationship. And I'll focus on two. One is the Delgama case, and the other is the Chinook-Nagawin, which is a constitution from the Anishinaabe Nation. And then I'll provide some sort of bring it all together and talk about what I see as the contemporary phase of the relationship is now into this, what I call the politics of Indigenous translation. And I'll say a few words about that. So quickly, well, not so quickly, but that's why I asked if there are any lawyers here, because they're going to trip me up. They're going to trip me up and heckle me like a woman tennis player. Anyway, so Aboriginal rights in Canada, I had said that it's really from the White Paper 1969. So, most of you are probably familiar with this, but I'm going to walk through it anyway. The White Paper was significant because it was an attempt to get out of the Indian business on the part of the Liberal government. And what is important here, and this is a really hard sell for Indigenous students, is that that view of the White Paper is attached to a serious, somewhat coherent moral theory, liberalism, right? Privileges the individual, right? We're all familiar with that. Trudeau got swept into office, right, on this idea of seeing Canada as a just society, of which Indigenous peoples could be included in that vision of Canada as a just society where we share, right, a view of citizenship, and that view is rooted, right, in this idea of privileging and celebrating individual equality as a foundation of a democratic constitutional democracy. And the thing is that a lot of Indigenous peoples agree with that, right? That's a good idea. And, but in doing so, they were going to get rid of the treaties, they were going to get rid of the Indian Act and Department of Indian Affairs, which was probably seen by many as a good thing. And there was a big response to that. And the one response was in the form of the Red Paper. A lot of people don't know there was also a Brown Paper from the chiefs of Alberta, and I threw that in there. But the response was basically, no, you can't do that because you are in a treaty relationship with us, right? So the Red Paper was a response from the Indian chiefs of Alberta, and their response was, you can't unilaterally do away with the treaty relationship. And that remains a central claim for Indigenous peoples and in Indigenous politics. A treaty relationship by necessity is a nation-to-nation relationship. And the thing is that this is what the federal government says as well. It's not like it's different, right? But they have a different understanding because aside from the belief that in the sanctity of individual rights, the other belief is that the sovereignty of the nation state is the superior form of political sovereignty. And therein lies the conflict. That for Indigenous peoples, they argue, we possess a form of nationhood that is not as a nation state. We're not nation states, we get that, but we are nations. And in international law, the state is obligated to recognize that form of nationhood and sovereignty in the form of the treaty relationship. So there's that sort of politics that's been played out over several decades. And then, of course, through the 70s, with this Trudeau basically backed down and said, well, all right, I guess maybe you do have some rights. And they spent the 70s hashing those out with consultation and this, giving rise to this idea of this duty to consult, which I always thought of as turned into this duty to con and a duty to insult. So they sort of bring those together. And with the creation of Section 35.1, should all know what Section 35.1, the existing Aboriginal and treaty rights of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada are hereby recognized and affirmed. This was seen in 1982 as just almost mind-blowing in a global sense, because here we had a liberal society built on this foundation of respecting individual rights, now is taking a group of people out of their own society and according them special rights and protecting them in the Constitution. This was a huge deal, right? And you know, Americans were saying this is Canada's a failed experiment and this kind of thing, but this was seen as a really progressive move in democratic theory, and in some ways it is. But what happened out of this in 1982 was that the meaning of Aboriginal rights became hooked and dependent on the courts. So the Supreme Court of Canada ended up becoming the final arbiter of the meaning and content of Aboriginal rights. So what this means is that even within this Indigenous view of the treaty relationship as being nation to nation, it's nation with a big N and with a nation with a little n, where the big N ends up calling the shots at the end of the day. And therein lies this fundamental tension, right, with the relationship itself. So jumping ahead, I would say that Section 35 has run its course, and in the various decisions along the way, and one in particular I'll look at, is the Delgama decision. Well, I'll wait till I get there to fill that in. So the courts now are deciding cases, and a couple of cases are central, important. There's the Sparrow decision, but the two that I want to discuss, because I think they're really central to moving the relationship in a particular direction, fall on the heels of the Oka crisis in 1990. And so the Oka crisis was, it was about a Mohawk community saying, enough. We own this land, and if we allow these tractors to come on and destroy this land, we're going to lose it forever. So we're not going to do it. So that's what happened with this. Tracy Deer actually was a student of mine at Dartmouth, so she has a movie out. I'm blanking. Oh, don't tell her. Oh, I'm being filmed. Sorry, Tracy. What's it called? Her Beans. Yeah, sorry. Okay, sorry, Tracy. So the fallout from Oka was the creation, one of the fallout was this creation of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. So that was why it was important. Now, I think there is the relationship between Vander Peet Delgama and RCAP's final report, as you can see, 96 and 97, that period of time is really important, I think, for shaping the Indigenous politics in Canada. And in the Delgama case, now the Delgama case is, I'll say a little bit about this. I should keep my eye on the time, I guess. Eh? How long do I have? Can you be done in another 25 minutes? Oh, sure, yeah. So anyway, all right, so we lost our land. We lost our land, and I had to move to England. So the Delgama case was important because the Gitxsan and Wet'suwet'en, and this is the same Wet'suwet'en people involved in pipeline politics right now, and I think you're seeing the fallout from the Supreme Court's not making a decision in the Delgama case. What I think was incredible about the Delgama decision was they say, their claim basically is, we still own our lands, right? And there were no treaties signed here, which means you're on the hook. The federal government is on the hook for making a treaty with us because you can't unilaterally assert sovereignty over our territories when we haven't consented to it, right? That's built right into the Royal Proclamation of 1763. And the courts agree with that. And they knew that was coming down the pipeline. So, pipeline, literally. So they said, well, they went to court. And what was interesting was their methodology. I've sort of got my eye on Kirsten here because she knows this stuff way better than I do, is they took this two-track approach. One of them was they used the discourses of the state, so to speak, and the common law, right? So they found and reasoned a kind of the framework between the Royal Proclamation of 1763, 9124 in the Constitution Act in 1867, Section 88 of the Indian Act. How did BC become a province? What did they give up, and what did they sort of become empowered to legitimately assert? That sort of analysis, right, within constitutional law. But they decided to take another approach, a parallel one with that. I like to think of this as a kind of a two-row wampum approach, legal approach, which was, they said, you know what? We have our own ways of understanding our relationships to land. It's embedded in our own language. So they had evidence given by their elders, Johnny David, who spoke English, but he provided this evidence. The court actually went to his house because he was 94 years old, and they have these long transcripts now of his testimony where he's speaking his language, someone else is translating it from his community. The prosecutor's there sitting in the living room asking questions back and forth, and they're doing this through translation, even though Johnny David could have spoken English if he wanted to. But their point was, if you want to understand our relationships to land, and you want to look at the rightful place of our voices, our political voices, you have to go to our own language. To go to our own language, you'd have to go to our land. You have to experience that from the people who hold this knowledge, which are people like Johnny David. That was I think that was years ahead of its time. My community, so this would have been in the early 90s by the time the decision came out in December of 97. My own community had the decision in 1990. And what happened was we brought our elders up on the stand, and their testimony was just a good prosecutor is just awesome at, I mean, you ever see what a prosecutor does to an expert witness, a surgeon or something? They just ask the right questions to undermine, right, their sort of credibility. And it was just an awful thing, so we decided we weren't going to do that. And, but they did it. And so the court had this opportunity to engage Indigenous peoples in and on their own terms. And I think that had the court picked up the ball and run with it and actually said something a little more substantive about how do we understand this cross-cultural, how do we understand this problem of translation, right? How do we, what I would say now, the language I would use now is, how do we make room for Indigenous law within the common law, right? Because that's what they're asserting. They're asserting their own law, right, which is grounded in their own ways of understanding the world, their own language, right? They went through great trouble to explain the Kungaks, which was a song. It's a song sung in a potlatch, and in that song, in the performance, that their voices are connecting the community together to their potlatch system, to their totem system, to the land, right? It's invigorating those kinds of relationships in their community that are central to how they understand themselves as Wet'suwet'en people, as an Indigenous community. And that, to me, is what philosophy is. That's a coherent philosophical view of the world. But what do we do with that when it gets into the common law, where, and I have to allude back now to Vanderpeet, which was about Dorothy Vanderpeet selling salmon, where she was arrested because the argument was, well, you didn't traditionally sell salmon, and the only way you can sell salmon is if, what the court ends up saying, is if it becomes integral to your distinctive culture. When you think about that, what the court is saying is, we have a particular idea of who you are as Indigenous peoples, right? And we're saying that, well, you could catch fish to sustain your community, but you can't sell it because you didn't develop your economies by selling fish, as opposed to looking at, from the Indigenous perspective, recognizing us as a nation, right? In this treated relationship that you are also saying is what the nature of the relationship is. And we're celebrating this, and now you're saying that we don't measure up. to the criteria that you are laying out, right? But there's another kicker, and the integral to distinctive culture test has always been flagged, right, as look what happened in Vanderpeet kind of thing. But I also think there's another provision, and which is when the court says, look, I don't know if they said look, but, you know, they said, look, you know, surely, you know, and that's it. Don't call me Shirley, Judge. And they say that we're happy and willing to listen to you, what you have to say, right? We're open. This is what justice demands. However, when you come into a court of law, you need to use a language, and the term is cognizable, right? Cognitive. I mean, it goes right to your brain, right? So you need to use language that's cognizant to our legal system. So they're forcing them to take all of Johnny David's testimony, right, that he's very carefully laying out in and on his own terms, and they're saying, no, that's not what happens when it gets to the Supreme Court. You need to use a language that we can recognize, which is this language of rights and this hooked on to practices. I don't have enough time to go into that, but the duty to consult, the honor of the crown, all of these kinds of practices and concepts that have arisen since 1982. So the Delgama case then, basically what they're saying is, well, we will listen to what you have to say, but we're going to rule on what you told us in and on our own terms. Right? And the court had this opportunity, I think, to rule, to say something anyway about that, what I think is a deeply human problem. And it's one that democratic theory and constitutional law has yet to address. Right? And that's your generation's issue. Right? If Section 35 has gotten to the point where it can no longer do the work that it originally intended to do, which is to recognize the forms of difference between Indigenous ways of being, of thinking about the world and their relationships to their land. If we're going to respect that, it can only go so far. And I think that set things off in a different direction. At the same time that Delgama came out, and Vanderpeet shortly before that, RCAP's final report came out with, originally it was called the sort of vision chapter, but Jim Tully, my advisor, he was one of the architects, I guess you would call it, which may not always be a great word to use, but of this vision chapter, and he laid out in looking at how we understand the nature of the relationship. It's guided by these kind of practices of mutual recognition, mutual respect, mutual responsibility, and sharing. That's what a treaty relationship does. If there are any Haudenosaunee people here, this is the great law of peace, right? This reciprocity is really important and central. And one of the ideas in Indigenous political thought is, well, it's not as a template, it's something that's living and needs to be constantly renewed all the time. Because we evolve and we change and we understand things differently, and we need to go back to our communities and figure it out and come back again and argue again and renew. And what you're renewing is the treaty relationship itself, right? This is the idea, and this is what I think this is what RCAP was pointing towards. They looked at all the evidence and they said these are the practices that worked in the fur trade relationship, for example, and in solid treaty relationship. So. But what I see coming out of that, and what I call this Indigenous linguistic turn, is the response, right, to Delgama. It's on this, it's here, and then I'll go back. The fallout was this rise of this impact benefit agreement culture. So an impact benefit agreement, okay, sorry, I should wrap up Delgama first. So the court ruled against the Gitxsan-Wet'suwet'en, but only because of a technicality about the claim. So they said, well, basically, you claimed ownership, and now you're only claiming title, which is a concept in the common law itself, and you didn't provide evidence for that, so now we ordered a retrial. So if you're going to do this, you have to go back to court and do it all over again, right? That's what the court said. So they avoided having to do this sort of rich evaluation, I guess, or investigation into how the court in the common law could best understand the nature of this treaty relationship. And one of the fallouts from this was the impact benefit agreement is a very pragmatic way for multinational companies to open up and set up shop on Indigenous lands. And all they need to do is do that in negotiations with the Band Council, which is an Indian Act form of governance in communities. And where we really see this is in the Wet'suwet'en, in this larger context with the hereditary chiefs saying, no, the Indian Act Band Council is not the rightful political form of representation. And they've gone back now with this MOU, and you notice we haven't heard anything from it. And I think the community is trying to work this out as well. But what we also saw was this Indigenous communities starting to bring, and this Idle No More is a good example of this, their own ways of thinking and understanding the world into their politics in a way that I think is a fallout from the failure of Delgama. So it's a way that the communities have responded. And one way of teaching this is to look at these two very different ways of understanding the sources of Aboriginal rights and nationhood. And one is in this delegated view, which is rooted in the Indian Act, in the common law, grounded in this, in the sovereignty of the state, and the idea that if Aboriginal rights exist at all, it's because we accord them to you. We give them to you. And we're going to protect them in the Constitution, and we're going to hang that on a view of justice. The inherent view says, no, we were here first. Well, this is the line of argument. We were here first. We were here already as nations. We already had our own economic systems. We already had our understandings of justice. And we knew how to coexist peacefully. And when you showed up, you were just like any other people. We welcomed you into that relationship because we possess this inherent form of political sovereignty. And here's what's important and what has to go along with that, as in we never gave it up. We never gave it up in the treaty relationship. No matter how you tried to change that language, that's never going to hold up in a court of law. Yet decisions constantly are shaped by this language of extinguishment, right? That's the goal. That's the purpose of going to court. And Indigenous communities don't want to do that anymore. They don't want to go into a court and assert a form of nationhood, even rooted now in their traditional languages, because they know that the court is not going to engage, right, that perspective, that philosophical perspective, seriously. And that's what I'm trying to get at. So we have these two different approaches. Now, I just put down here 6 exemplars of how Indigenous nationhood is built around this idea of Indigenous peoples asserting, right, their spiritual relationships to land, their ways of understanding the world, their own philosophies. Any of you who have spent time in New Zealand know that the Maori have used this term Tino Rangitira Tenga, which kind of means chieftainship. It was the beauty of, if you haven't had a chance to read this, there are a couple of really good books about how the Treaty of Waitangi was signed in 1840. But what makes it, I think, a powerful treaty is that there are 2 versions. Well, there are more than 2 versions, but broadly speaking, 2 versions. There's an English interpretation of the treaty, which has its own oral traditions and its own written version, but there's also a Maori version, which has its own written versions, and it has a written version written by a well-meaning missionary at the time in Maori, but there's also an oral tradition that's present, so if any of you into hermeneutics and that sort of thing, the Treaty of Waitangi is a really interesting exercise in how we have the meeting place of 2 forms of law. Right, the British tradition and the Maori tradition. But I wish I could say more about this, but in looking at the contemporary relationship, what's happened is, and this is a point worth thinking about as well, is they've plucked the term Tino Rangitira Tenga out of there were just 3 articles in the treaty. One of them was around this idea of Tino Rangitira Tenga. The other was around Kawana Tenga, which has to do with administration, sort of governorship, and so on. But they plucked the terms out of their original home, and they've resituated them in English politics in contemporary New Zealand, Aotearoa. So what's happened is, I think Marx has this idea of rarefication, right? That our language, when we use it over and over and over again, it becomes rarefied and it loses the loses the contact from which it was originally used. And this is what the Maori are now, in talking to some of their law professors, Jacinta Ruhr, for example, says, you know, what we mean by this is not what's being used in the legal political relationship in English, yet we're using the term Tino Rangitira Tenga. So there's something I think that we need to learn about this, in particular our medicine people. I've already talked a little bit about Delgama, and I think the Wet'suwet'en blockades, what's going on now, pipeline politics, is a fallout from that same politics created that now has become part of the internal politics of the Wet'suwet'en people, which is they themselves don't know how to resolve staying true to their ancestors and their philosophical systems of thought rooted in their language. And now you're starting to get younger people who don't speak the language, so they've lost that sort of connection with the language that the elders had. In my community, it happened a long time ago. But it's another example, right, of the hereditary chiefs using their own language and their own approaches to generate a politics. And this is why the women have taken out to going on to the land, right, and building houses, right, tiny houses along the way to get back out on their land again. I talked briefly too about Oka. I think the Oka, Caledonia, 1492 Lamback Lane, what lies underneath this, and we didn't hear this in the news very often, but are the clan mothers and the Great Law of Peace, which is their sort of philosophical system and their ways of understanding how spirit works and how their relationships to land are central to what ultimately plays out in their everyday politics. Right? So the clan mothers, once again. Now, I'll just mention briefly, I was going to say more about this. This happened last time I gave a talk too, as I ran out of time and couldn't say much about the Chinook Nagaman, which is like for my own people. But the Chinook Nagaman, what makes the Chinook Nagaman interesting in this politics of Indigenous translation is the Anishinaabe Nation, which is 40 First Nations in Ontario, mostly if you go straight up from Toronto, sort of up and to the west. We wanted to come out with a new constitution, and as a way of offering it as a gift to the governments, as a way of saying this is how we think about the nature of the relationship. And I remember, because I was part of that process, and I remember a big meeting, and I remember the clan mothers got up and said, because we were getting close to ratifying it, and they said, this is not acceptable. And it's not acceptable because nowhere in this document, in this piece of paper, are our ways of understanding the world. So we had to go back, everybody went back to the communities, and what they did was they came out with a preamble. And this preamble is articulated in Anishinaabe Moan, which is our language, and it's not translated. So there's a political assertion built into that. And in this preamble, it's meant to be spoken. It's almost like a prayer. It's performative. And what it does is it lays out our 7 grandfather teachings articulated in Anishinaabe Moan. And it's a way of grounding this piece of paper, right, as they say. It's a way of binding this paper to the land and to the people through our language. So it takes our words or deeds. Well, it's gone now, but it was up there before. Words are deeds. Words matter. Right? And some words have spiritual import to them. Don't ask me what that means. That's up for, take an Indigenous Studies course. You know, the point is we have to figure out what that means. That's our job, right, as thinkers. We have to figure out what that means when they say, well, wait a minute, that these are profound, serious relationships that people have to the land, and we can't mock them, which is what has traditionally been happened. These are philosophical systems of thought. And I'll come back to that point. So the Anishinaabe is interesting because it has this preamble, and it's articulated in Anishinaabe, and then it switches to the articles of which are written in English, and it's offered as what Nigan Sinclair says as bagajiganan. It's a kind of a gift that you would offer in a treaty relationship. So when you accept a gift in a treaty relationship, the wampum belt, that's a profound act. That's a sacred act, and it binds you. It's a form of promise keeping in an Indigenous context. It's like smoking the pipe. You take your words, right, and you, in the sacred tobacco, and the words go up to the spirit world and they bind you, right, not just to your ancestors, but to those yet unborn, because there's an ethos around the seventh generation. It's a way of understanding the world that's just so unfamiliar to a lot of Western European people. So I mention this because it was a really important political move, but it also has spiritual and philosophical significance to the Anishinaabe, in particular our language speakers and our medicine people who we revere. I also mentioned this Whakatoan, which is actually a Cree concept, but it's also a Métis concept, and it's also is similar to the Inuit concept, as you can see there. I'm just going to call it IQ. These are their own concepts that they're now using in their policy making, and they guide their actions and how they think about their relationships between people and the land and in their policy making. So this question, how do we listen to Indigenous peoples in and on their own terms, to me is a great question. Of course, what goes along with that, if you're going to listen to somebody in and on their own terms, how do you speak in and on your own terms is also part of that relational kind of question, and it goes on both sides of the conversation. So I do have a couple of things to maybe suggest or that I've thought about in this politics of what I call Indigenous translation. And I think, I'm not sure, translation is not the right word, so I need to come up with a better word, because it's not about finding one word that means this word. It's about generating, maybe this is where the Wittgensteinianism, or as they call me, some of my friends call me Wittgensteinian, sneaks in to, was I think the virtue of Wittgenstein, maybe in the question and answer period or conversation later, you know, what I like about the later Wittgenstein is he's about attitude, right? And his views on meaning are very pragmatic and very useful for Indigenous peoples to say, this is how we should understand our language, that the meaning of our term is in how we use it in our actual practices. So if I use a term like nationhood, then we need to unpack the language game of which it's being used. I just think that's a fruitful way, pragmatic way, right, of thinking, because unlike John Rawls, who says it's political, not metaphysical, I think from an Indigenous perspective, we want to say that it's political and metaphysical, and we need to decide how to deal with the messy metaphysics, which of course as philosophers, this is a bad word for many certainly analytic philosophers. However, and I'll just flag this so we can talk about this. I think the problem with this, what is it, Bill C-15? Is that the UNDRIP? I think the problem with UNDRIP is they're trying to subsume UNDRIP into existing Canadian policy when it needs to be reconfigured to this nation-to-nation relationship. So that's why their lawyers looked at it and said, you know, there's no coincidence that Canada, US, Australia, and New Zealand didn't sign off on UNDRIP in 2007. It's because they had to have their lawyers look at it and decide, no, it doesn't threaten the integrity of the state. Article 46 says, well, you know, whatever has gone on before here, and they use the word spiritual relationships in UNDRIP in certain sections, in certain articles, which is the first time I've ever seen that. But at the end of the day, it says, well, nothing in this declaration can undermine the integrity of the nation state, right? So, you know, that's basically saying we still control the language. However, I think what goes along with this Indigenous translation is making room for Indigenous law as a third order of law in Canada. And that's, I think, what people, that's why I flagged Josh Nichols and Aaron Mills, and there are others Val Napoleon out in Victoria, and this is what they're trying to do, to make room for Indigenous law. We have the common law, we have the civil law, we have Indigenous law. And they say, oh, well, that means we're going to have 500 types of law. And I said, well, not really, but so, I mean, that's our problem. That's what we have to work on. It's a hard problem, you know. And but we can do this. We can do this, people. See how I am an optimistic person at heart. Yeah, we can do it. So, and here's one way I think we can do this. So, I started thinking. A long time ago, an elder once told me, in fact, just before I started school here, they said, you know, you're going to get so-called educated, and, you know, I think it's great, but, you know, the best way to convince people to understand who we are and our rights is one person at a time. That's the best way to do it. You do it individually. And I think to a certain extent that's true, because I notice when I talk to people one-on-one, they're much more open to listening, and they're not, well, academia is a little different because there's sort of this built-in hostility, you know, to I'm right and you're wrong and I'm going to tell you why you're wrong. But I think it would be a great idea to have our best, I'm going to start with law because I think law actually can make the changes that are necessary. But start with law. Take our sort of best students. Right? What do they do now? If you are a top law school graduate, a lot of them like to do internships, right, with Supreme Court justices and that sort of prestigious thing. I think we should be sending our students to do internships with medicine people, places like Manitoulin Island, Wikwemikong. There are lots of communities where they still have medicine people and language speakers. And I think that if you went there for 2 years, you could learn the language, you learn the ceremonies. They take care of you. And I can't imagine a really smart person with a knowledge of law and who somehow wants to end up being a judge or a professor or whatnot. I cannot imagine that person making a decision about Indigenous rights that would not consider, right, that kind of sensitivity and awareness that I'm talking about in understanding that you can have a nation-to-nation relationship without undermining the integrity of the nation state. In fact, if we did, then Indigenous peoples, and many do already, see themselves as part of the Canadian culture and society, right? The Inuit, for example. It's less so now, but it certainly was that case. They always carried the Canadian flag with them. But I think what you're trying to do is you're not going after the arguments. You're going after changing the way people can see things for themselves. And that embodies a different kind of pedagogy. And I think that learning on the land, and this is my last point, that Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous ways of knowing, so I've always been part of an Indigenous studies program, which I am also at Toronto. And one of the things, so, well, I guess I might as well tell you what happened. So I got offered a chair at Queen's Law School in Indigenous law last year. And I just got to Toronto, and I felt a little bit uneasy. First of all, I'm not a lawyer, so there was that part of it. But one of the things that they wanted me to do was to create programs that brought students to the land, land-based learning. And Indigenous studies, we've been trying to do this for years. So Toronto responded, and I stayed at Toronto with a retention offer. But one of the things was they changed my teaching. And I haven't actually checked in with my colleagues how they feel about this, but I'll worry about that later. Because one of the courses that I'm going to be teaching, so I do a large 250 student class on Aboriginal rights in Canada, right? So that's a sort of standard course. Although at Dartmouth I had classes with 6 to 20 students, so those days are gone forever. But the other two courses are really interesting. One is is a seminar that I'm calling it the Indigenous Research Consortium. And one of the problems with learning from Indigenous peoples is you don't invite an individual speaker. Well, you can, of course. But the best way, I think, is you bring people from the communities. You bring them to Toronto. You bring them into the classroom. But they're coming to Takaranto. They're coming to Indigenous lands. We need to reinvigorate these kinds of protocols. And the Haudenosaunee are huge on these protocols, right here in Montreal. And part of what we're doing is we're bringing an Indigenous community into our community, right? And we learn from them, not in a lecture, but by inviting them to stay and to meet people in the community and to get out into the community and also participate in the seminar. So, so now we'll be looking at modules, you know, and we're doing one on the Wet'suwet'en, we're doing one on the Maori, we're doing one on the Sami, and Indigenous women in politics, that sort of thing, and bringing people to this sort of richer experience, intellectual experience. And then the third course is going to be taught on our homelands, Nidaki Banan in Lake Temagami. So I'm going to develop a course to work with medicine people and bring students to the land. That will involve learning the medicines, learning some of our language, more advanced courses, because I think what we need is to set up a learning center as well, and to get students out on the land and listening to the appropriate people. I'm not a traditionalist, so I can't teach, and I shouldn't, because it's not my place to teach this knowledge. So I'm very careful about try to say what I can say, and then, as Wittgenstein says, you need to stay silent with the rest of it. So, but these things are expensive, right? You know, and but it's an Indigenous approach to learning. It's an Indigenous knowledge that I think can be brought into the university in a way that I think creates within the learning experience different attitudes about thinking, not only about who Indigenous peoples are and how they think about the world, but for them to take a step back and reflect on their own place in the world. And I think that kind of nurturing pedagogy is what's missing in contemporary politics, right? This bipartisanship, which is so deeply embedded in our culture. And I think Indigenous peoples and Indigenous ways of knowing can play a role in loosening, I think, those constraints. So I'll stop there. Thank you for listening. Oh, I forgot this. Notice Chi Miigwech is on top, eh? Just want to point that out. Sorry, that was... I'm happy to answer any questions if there are, unless I've answered them all. And,
I'm going to moderate from here rather than jumping up and making people mask and unmask. At the RGCS Lecture Series, the first question is reserved for a member of the Research Group on Constitutional Studies Student Fellowship. Maeve, want to go to the microphone up there?
Cool. Is it all? Yeah, you can hear me. Hi, I'm Maeve. I'm a second year MA student. Oh, mask off? Is it okay if I stay mask on?
it's hard for me to hear you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Fair.
Oh, yay.
Yeah, so I guess I was wondering if you could elaborate on how you think about translation. I know you said maybe it's not the best word, so I'm curious, like, what are other cognate terms or other ways we can think about it? And then I guess beyond that, when I think about translation, especially in like the court cases, about how it's very constraining. But I'm also wondering, like, in a lot of what you're saying, I hear how it can be very, maybe perhaps generative, or I'm wondering, like, do you see like processes of translation as being something that can be generative, not in a way that like to diminish the existence of settler colonialism, but
right.
Yeah, I'm curious to know what you think.
Thank you.
That. Thank you.
Actually, and thank you for that, because you actually raised an issue that I didn't mention. And I actually wrote out my talk. I've never written a talk. I've been an academic for 25 years or so, and I've never written a talk, but I wanted to write this talk out because I wanted to make sure I covered everything. And then I got about halfway through and said, I'm never going to do this. Never, not with Daniel sitting. I'm going to say, do you remember the time? You know, this sort of thing. So, but you raise an issue that I think is part of this optimism, I suppose, that I still have, which is in Peet, of all cases, and elsewhere, one of the things the court says, it characterizes Section 35 as a form of reconciliation. And it's really funny because it's in the larger vision of reconciliation, this understanding of reconciliation gets lost, but I think it could be really hold a lot of potential for bridging ways of thinking and ways of knowing. So characterize Section 35 rights as a reconciliation of Indigenous laws and customs and traditions with, and the word I would use is unilateral assertion of state sovereignty. So basically it says, well, yeah, we know you have your laws and customs and traditions and you explain them and so on, but it needs to be reconciled, right, or subsumed with this assertion, right, of the superiority of state sovereignty. But I started thinking about this because it seems to me, and I mentioned this to people like Professor Mark Walters and Brian Slattery and John Burroughs, and seems to me that the rightful place to understand the laws and customs and traditions is within Indigenous law. So it's a bridging term. And I think another thing that could go along with this kind of apprenticeship program or idea that I'm thinking about is that in cases about Indigenous issues need to be decided in a different way. And I think that form of reconciliation requires us to look to Indigenous philosophies, Indigenous ways of understanding the world as this rightful source of our laws and customs and traditions. So that's one way that I think the common law could evolve to accommodate Indigenous voices. And then what goes along with that, though, I think, and so I've written a paper about this, a longer paper about, I've always had Wittgenstein in the background, right, of my thinking academically, and influenced by Jim Tully and Taylor to a certain extent, but others. And I think that there is a way that we can understand language. There's a way that we can certainly understand political language in a way that we can allow for flexibility in the meaning of our terms, normative terms. So it all hinges on this idea of normativity. What counts as normative language? And a Wittgensteinian approach to language and meaning, and then philosophy itself, what it means to be philosophical as a way of life, is more amenable, right, to looking at and to seeing the treaty relationship in this way that I've been laying out. In other words, it's a method, it's an approach. It's a thinker who has thought about something in this realm that now Indigenous intellectuals in particular, but we need help with that, and also in conversation with our medicine people in ways that we can make that more useful in a kind of academic context. So that's, I think, a way, right, of doing this in a serious way. And I mean, I'm working on our governance committee in my community because we have to come up with a new constitution. And I have to take these kinds of ideas that I've been talking about and I have to present it to my cousins and other people I know and family members in a language that, you know, say, well, you know, say incommensurability issue, grandma, kind of thing. It's just like it goes nowhere in the community. So I've got to come up, I got to find that way of doing that. And that's the work of a community. And I think that's what young people are able to be more flexible with than I am in my generation. That's the way I see it. Anyway. Thanks. That thing too?
Thank you. I thought this was really fascinating. I have just one question that for me is really interesting is on the topic of legitimacy. So you spoke a lot about how the treaty is basically seems to be the source of legitimacy, like on a kind of a indigenous political philosophy. And I'm kind of curious on that because the treaty is at the same time sacred. It's political. So I really like this thing. The political is metaphysical, but it seems also there's kind of a link here also with what we call the theological at the same point. So I think this is whole kind of setup here that is interesting to me, especially in relationship to how we conceive, especially in mostly liberal theory like state sovereignty, in totally different terms, like in terms of like legitimacy. So I'm really kind of interested if you could say a few more words on like how I'm just trying like to unpuzzle this kind of riddle for me at this point of like how can the treaty have priority, because I think there's something really strong about that, and I'm really curious to think about it, especially in non-social contract kind of term, because it would be easy to say the treaty is a contract, so this is kind of legitimacy, but I kind of like have this intuition that it's not at all kind of the same terms here, so I would be curious to hear a bit more about that. Yeah.
Yeah, good question again. Yeah, my immediate answer is I don't know, but I think where I would take this is in the idea that in an ongoing political relationship, you need to generate language that's going to nurture an ongoing dialogue. And I think the Indigenous perspective of seeing the relationship as a nation-to-nation relationship has always been offered, right? Back to Niga and Sinclair's point out, Bagajiganan as a form of gift giving, that there are certain ideas, and I think this is true in philosophy, there are certain thinkers who offer their thoughts as gifts, as forms of gifts to humanity. And people see this. You see this with great writers. You know, the way that they tell a story is just something it's beautiful in and of itself. And I think that is the level of agreement, right, that we need to somehow achieve in our everydayness, right? Because so much is at stake in a lot of this. If there were natural resources involved in any of this, we would have had self-government a long time ago, right? But there's a lot at stake economically, and I think that view which is being further embedded with the impact benefit agreement approach. The one thing I didn't say about that was you can enter into an impact benefit agreement without negotiating what the nation-to-nation relationship means. They're saying, look, we know we can't define title in a way that makes everybody happy, so we're not going to deal with that. We just want to set up a gold mine on your lands. How can we do this and not have to deal with this stuff? It's a pragmatic view, right? Modus vivendi. It's just kind of a way that we can coexist and move on, right? But without having to deal with a substantive, Indian stuff and ways of thinking attached to it, which is kind of, for the most part, taken to be nonsense. That's the other thing about this as well, is I'm offering these views or these ways of thinking that, people who spend a lot of time with Indigenous peoples, and this kind of reminder I get, that's not the way it is by the time you get into a government. My cousin is chief now of our community, and she says, boy, it's nothing like that when you go into a negotiation room. So it's worse than the problem that we are sort of discussing here, way worse. So how do we loosen, right, that normative language in a way, or attitudes, it's really about attitudes, in a way that creates a kind of space, right, for that Indigenous perspective to be respected. And I think when we look at hanging reconciliation on the fact that it also involves Indigenous ways of understanding the world, not just what happened in the past and we need to make it better, but that by renewing the relationship, we're renewing it in this relationship of coexistence, right? This was the virtue of RCAP's vision, I think, was they took that very seriously. So it's a way, and I realize it's not a full answer, but I think because it's in the future, right? It's as a possibility. you know, and for example, when I was a student here, there was myself, Audra Simpson, Eldon Yellowhorn, I think, and there was one other person. There were like 4 Indigenous graduate students here when I was here, you know, and now it's, you know, there are many, but it's not a given that that's turning out to be a good thing. And I think what I see that kind of makes me sad is to see that there are forms of assimilation, and this is very key to my novel as well. There are forms of assimilation that Indigenous peoples themselves are not, that we need to unpack, right? In this process of using the English language to win our cases and so on comes at a price, right? And we see this in community, in particular my own, because we have maybe 3 language speakers left out of 1,000 people. So, but you also see revitalization. So language revitalization is key to that as well. Because, and of course, the way that I think about language revitalization is this kind of spiritual, philosophical revitalization. It's a ways of thinking, you know, that, and not merely, to answer your question, it's not merely about finding the right word to use in this sentence or in this translation process, because translation has to do with generating the right attitudes for how we understand different ways of living and being in the world. And I'm not sure how to do that. And I think my generation of people who were definitely coming at things from 2 cultures, you know, but now there are people like Alan Corbiere, who's from Manitoulin Island, Anishinaabe guy, brilliant guy. He was born and raised as a traditionalist. He knows where all the petroglyphs are, you know, in his territory. The elders have given him that knowledge. And now he's a professor of history, so he approaches history with these methodologies that are rooted in an unproblematic way that for me have been an intellectual philosophical exercise, mostly using things like hermeneutics or Wittgenstein, you know. So I think the methodologies that are coming up from the land are being nurtured in a way that I think could really be fruitful. I was going to say, is he leaving?
Hey, Dale.
Hi.
It's really nice to see you.
Good to see you too.
And as you can see, my hair has remained as dark as yours. Aging is just about
And
the same.
Elizabeth is totally gray.
Yeah, but we've been aging at just about the same rate. So my question, which is really an open-ended one, I'd be very curious to hear you reflect on exactly where you ended up in that last comment, which has to do with language revitalization, right? If you talk to a sociolinguist, right, and you said 3 language speakers left, right, 3 native speakers, they'd say, you know, forget about it, right? It's
Dead language. Yeah.
dead language. Now, so what do we, you know, so what do we do, right? Is this something, you know, I was struck by your suggestion at the end of your talk that, you know, some of the law students, rather than going and spending time with Supreme Court justices, should go and spend a couple of years, and you said learning the language, right? So to what degree, I mean, we have an Indigenous Languages Act right now from 2019. I don't know what you think about that, but you know, I think it's fair to say that many people who take the question seriously have seen it as a little bit like weak tea. So I'd be curious, is it something that, for example, we should all take up? For example, you know, New Zealand now, the idea that, you know, it's everybody's business, right? That Maori survive, and that, you know, it's for the schools, right? In you know, downtown Auckland. So I'm going to trail off and just sort of give you an opportunity just to develop a little bit on that. You know, how do we make it everybody's business? Should we be making it everybody's business?
It's not a given, is it, at all? It's not at all. And one of the things I remember taking the bus up Park Avenue, and because you know where I used to live in the plateau, next to the Hasidic Jewish community. And I remember sitting on the bus, and I was reading a book on, I don't know, some Indigenous issue. And he started talking to me. And it occurred to me that he had a very different view about how you protect your culture, right? And I've been thinking recently, I would love to get some of our medicine people to meet some people in the Hasidic Jewish community. You know, I think it would be really interesting to see and hear, because there are a couple of things that our Indigenous peoples are learning now, which is, oh, we can develop our economies without assimilating. We can do it on our own terms, kind of thing. But I think there was something you said that made me want to think about revitalization. I think it's a question that Indigenous scholars and intellectuals, this needs to be discussed more in Indigenous studies, which is, and I didn't even get into it because I'm not even sure what to do about how to think about this, which is, it seems easier, my whole view is easier to understand when you're dealing with Indigenous languages and speakers of that language, in particular First speakers, because the forms of difference are stark, right? But I also know medicine people who speak English and only English. And they've inherited from their elders the practices and the traditions and the ways of thinking and being that are not steeped in our language. And that's hard to think about. Because then, first of all, then it means anyone can be Indigenous, right? If maybe that's what it says. But it means also that maybe there's something, what's his name, Hayden King at Exeter University, he says, I love your view, Dale. I like what you say about the importance of our medicine people, because I also respect our medicine people. But basically, you're buying into an essentialist view of what Indigenous cultures are, you know, and you're hanging it all on language. I say, well, I'm not sure if it certainly can be seen that way, because as a Wittgensteinian, it's language all the way down, right? So I realized that, oh my gosh, that's true. I am actually saying it's all language, right, in some ways, because we have to go after the normative language. What pulls me back from this, though, and this is what's useful, I think, in the relationship itself, is that the relationship is by necessity political, right? And Indigenous peoples have chosen to take these forms of difference and make them matter in this sort of public realm. So, in other words, we have to be strategic, and we've had to be strategic, and we will continue to need to be strategic. So part of being self-determining is for us to figure out then, what do we do with our languages and our traditions and our practices and customs, and be free to do that in communities that are healthy. And you know, when you can't, it's amazing to fly over northern Ontario and to look down and go, you know, they can't drink the water around here. The water's all bad. Like, it's amazing when you start thinking about the problems that Indigenous communities have to overcome just to have a basic quality of life. So we still have those things to deal with. At the same time, you know, I think Hobbes is right that philosophy requires leisure time. You know, so to think about these issues as we, you know, I remember meeting this chief, a leader, I don't know if he's chief, from Oaxaca in Mexico at a conference, and I had mentioned Wittgenstein. He came up to me afterwards and says, you know, we don't talk about Wittgenstein in my community, and it doesn't go anywhere. We're just basically trying not to get shot, you know, and so I'm aware that I think there are good things about this whole system that we are engaged and participating in that we need to figure out, but we need to figure it out ourselves in relationship to our communities. So one of the things that Indigenous studies programs absolutely have to do, and Dartmouth did not do this at all, is we have to nurture relationships with Indigenous communities themselves. You know, we need people, for example, someone told me that at U of T, there are Native communities in the surrounding area that would not, they would not want their children to work for the University of Toronto. Like, never mind faculty or, you know, whatever, but they just wouldn't, because they're not friendly to Indigenous peoples and so on. And I was kind of taken aback by that, you know. So there's a lot of relationship building that our institutions, meaning education, universities, need to do in nurturing, I think, Indigenous studies. Like this, for example, the seminar that I'm teaching is actually also political science, Indigenous studies, and Douglas Sanderson, worked with Douglas Sanderson, although he doesn't know that yet, so don't mention it to him, at the law school, who's a Cree law professor. In other words, that what Indigenous studies does cuts across disciplines, right? And we need to own up to that as well, and I think that's a virtue that we can bring to an institution, but then it needs to create the space to back off. And this was one of the things at the Royal Commission, David Hawkes used to say this all the time. We have to know when to back off and let Indigenous peoples take that sort of responsibility for themselves. And I think there are lots of young people in particular. 2 of them are my graduate students, so I'm really grateful for that. Who want to do that work in their communities. So I think that's kind of the way I would initially reflect on that.
Okay, we have a little bit of final business before we adjourn to the reception. The first piece of business is that we have a copy of This Is Not a Peace Pipe to give away.
What? It's not sold out?
To a student. 35 is Sasha. I haven't seen Sasha. Are you here?
Yeah.
Great. Okay.
Yay, she won.
Dale, would you do the honors handing it to her?
Oh, sure. Did I sign it already?
We'll do that afterwards. No, I didn't sign it for you.
Oh, so this is what it looks like. Yeah, you're welcome. Do we have elbows?
Second piece of business is to talk about a few upcoming events. Tomorrow, another McGill alum, political theorist Simone Chambers, is giving a talk in another of the Lynn Center's research groups called Wrecking the Public Sphere, New Authoritarians and the Digital Attack on Pluralism and Truth. There is an upcoming talk in the Research Group on Global Justice series by Dale's colleague, Peggy Cohn. The ongoing RGCS collaboration with Stanford and Duke rotates to Stanford this year on April 1st and 2nd for the next Political Theory in and as Political Science workshop. The Lynn Center's annual lecture, the one event that is not tied to a particular research group but brings us all together, is April 7th at this time in this room, given by Oxford historian Rana Mitter. The next event in the RGCS Lecture series, the remaining event of that for this semester, will be given the week after that, April 14th, by Daniel Ziblatt from Harvard, co-author of the book How Democracies Die. And at the end of May, May 26th and 27th, a conference co-sponsored by RGCS and the Research Group on Global Justice called Transcending Settler Colonialism, Decolonization, Reconciliation, and Transformation. Information on all of those events can be found on the Lynn Center's website, and if you'd like to be kept informed of Lynn Center events on an ongoing basis, there's information there on how to email our coordinator, Nina Arendt, who did crucial organizational work in this, as in all of our events, and emailing Nina will mean that you get informed about those on an ongoing basis. We will now adjourn to a reception. You have to bring your drinks, I believe this is the right rule, back to the tables in order to be able to socialize unmasked with drinks. When you get up from the tables to move around, you have to remask, but once every so often, since we can't in any formal way just mix, I encourage people to get up with their drink, remask, and go to another table to mix there. And people who are going to the dinner, given what kind of a day it is, it's my intention to walk. It's about a 25-minute walk. So we will meet out at the door of the faculty club at 7 o'clock promptly to set out on foot. And with that, please join me in very warmly thanking Professor Dale Turner.